Hi, and welcome to our first podcast in the biology series. Our first podcast will be an introduction to the biology that we'll be studying throughout this year. So biology by definition is the study of life, and life as we knew it arose around 3.5 billion years ago. Um, they're sort of saying it's anywhere between 3.4 and 3.6 billion years ago. It's a range because the first organisms were single-celled organisms, and so they were very, very small, and that was the only life on Earth for millions of years, and organisms over time evolved, and we're talking a long period of time that those organisms would have been evolving. So new organisms over time arose from older kinds. Today, we find that there's millions of species and they inhabit almost every region of Earth. So looking at the biology program, we can identify themes that are common in any biology course. And some of those themes we may have covered in other units and in other courses, and some of them we have yet to cover. So the first of those themes is the idea of cell structure and function. And cell structure and function, remember, is we covered a little bit in grade 9 science, and we came back to it in grade 11 biology, and has to do with living organisms made of cells. The idea of stability and homeostasis, well, that was our huge grade 11 topic, reproduction and inheritance. So we started that in grade 9, and we are coming back to that this year, and especially to look at this key factor here. We'll be focusing in on inheritance. One that we haven't covered but is very interesting is the idea and the theory of evolution, and we'll look at that in this unit. The interdependence of organisms, that's a fancy word for the science of ecology, which was grade 10 science. And the idea of matter, energy, and organization, and we talk about that from 9 to 12 in any science course. So looking very quickly at cell structure and function, cells are the basic unit of life. All organisms are made of and they develop from cells, and there's many different kinds of cells that exist. So this cell, for example, is a type of algae. And so it's a single-celled organism. It's photosynthetic, meaning that it makes its own food from the sun. And it's a type of cell that we can find on our planet. All cells will contain a set of instructions called DNA, though, and that's the genetic information. We'll deal more of that when we look at DNA and genetics. So looking at the next theme very quickly is stability and homeostasis. So remember, by definition, homeostasis is the ability of an organism to maintain stable internal conditions. So kinds of conditions that an organism can maintain, like this seal here, needs to maintain its temperature. Obviously, it lives in the Arctic, and that could be a potential problem for freezing. It needs to maintain its water content. Seals live primarily in or near aquatic environments, so they need to maintain water content. Chemical contents, so things like pH, all of these things need to be maintained by living organisms, and that's done through homeostasis. Moving on to reproduction and inheritance. So all organisms produce new organisms, and those organisms are very much like themselves, and this is what we call reproduction. Now, along with reproduction, organisms will be able to transmit hereditary information to their offspring, and that's where the idea of inheritance comes in. And what is that hereditary information? That hereditary information is transmitted through DNA. And DNA is the genetic information in all cells. So all living things have some form of DNA, or they may have something called RNA, which we'll talk about later in the course. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. So it is one of our macromolecules, which we will talk about as well later in the course. And it contains instructions for traits and genes. Basically, it makes these. It makes proteins. And proteins are an integral part of things like genes and traits. Now, DNA exists in every body cell, and it's exactly alike. The only place where DNA is different and has been modified is in our sex cells. When we look at reproduction, we'll look at that in more detail. So with sexual reproduction, hereditary information from two different organisms are combined. So to look at that very quickly, we have an egg and we have a sperm. They both contain DNA, one of them from mom, one of them from dad, and they will combine to form a zygote. And a zygote is a fertilized egg. Now the zygote contains both sets of DNA from mom and dad. Moving on, the next theme that we'll look at very briefly, and we'll cover in a lot of detail in this course, is evolution. So the evolution says that populations of organisms change or evolve over generations of time. And evolution is the best explanation to explain why we have different species and how those different species came into existence. It also is the best explanation to explain how modern organisms are related to past organisms. And finally, evolution provides a basis for exploring relationships among different groups of organisms. So when we look at ideas like how we classify organisms, so where we put them on the tree of life, we use evolution as a basis for that. To explain relationships and who's more related to who. The next theme is the idea of interdependence of organisms. And remember, that is really just the interactions of organisms with one another and with their environment, which is the study of ecology. So as an example of an interdependence of organisms, many insects like this bee here depend on flowers. Flowers obviously for food. The flowers, on the other hand, they depend on the insects for pollination, so for reproduction. And one organism is drastically affected by the populations of another organism, and that's the idea of interdependence. So all organisms need things from the environment, like nutrients, water, different types of gases, and a healthy environment like this wetland here is dependent on the stability and the functioning of organisms in that environment. Okay, the last theme, matter, energy, and organization. So living things like these two students here are very highly organized. Even this apple here is very highly organized. And being highly organized, they require a constant supply of energy. Okay, that's my short form for energy. And we need that energy in order to maintain an orderly state. Now, energy itself on this planet, on Earth, comes from the sun, whether it's direct or indirect. And the process that starts it all is the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses solar energy, transforms it into chemical energy, and that can be used by all living things. This formula right here is a very important formula that I need you to make sure you understand and make sure that you can write out. And this is the formula for photosynthesis. Now, do not forget when you're writing out that formula that we need light energy. Okay, our next podcast will be dealing with the scientific method, and hope you enjoyed.